화이팅.
화이팅. 네. 시작하면 되나요? 네. 반갑습니다. 네. 저는 한국의 저는 한국 냉동기술 전문가의 민현주라고 합니다.
Hello, nice to meet you. My name is Han-Jae-moon. I'm an expert World Skill Korea for the Refrigeration and Air Conditioning skills.
네, 저희가 이렇게 유튜브를 하게 된 동기가 이제 코로나 때문에 여러분들하고 많이 소통을 해야 되는데 그런 여건이 안 돼서 이런 장을 마련했습니다.
The reason why we opened this streaming show for all of you guys to make some communication between you and us under the COVID-19 situation.
네, 뭐 한편으로는 떨리기도 하고 긴장도 되고 또 설레기도 하고 그렇습니다.
Actually, I'm just feeling a little bit nervous, but I'm just trying to be enjoy this whole session with you.
저희가 오늘 그 유튜브 방송을 하게 된 계기는 저희가 이제 그 동영상을 교육용 동영상을 저희가 찍었는데 그 동영상을 만들게 된 동기가 이제 코로나와 무관하지 않습니다.
Actually, we already made some kind of a video clip for giving some lecture to you. So we just are trying to make these things as a chance under the COVID-19 situation with the video.
비디오 내용이 저희가 뭐 너무 짧은 시간에 만들어서 좀 내용이 이렇게 완벽하지 못해서 그 내용을 좀 보고 부족한 면을 이렇게 오늘 4차에 걸쳐서 이제 설명을 좀 드리는 시간을 갖도록 하겠습니다.
Actually, we have a very tight schedule to make this video, so it can be not that much perfect. So we just try to make this lecturing streaming sessions for complementing the previous video.
저희가 이 유튜브를 방송하고 동영상을 제작하는 거는 좀 내년 올해 원래 상해에서 있을 대회가 내년으로 미뤄졌는데 대회에서 이루어질 수 있는 상황들 사전에 좀 소통하는 그런 시간을 갖도록 하는 것도 취지가 있습니다.
Actually, as all of you guys know that the Shanghai World Skill has delayed about for 1 year because of the COVID-19 situation. So we try to make this YouTube live session and our lecturing video clip for making good communication between you and us.
저희가 오늘부터 4차에 걸쳐서 이제 방송을 하게 되는데 그 내용은 맞고 뭐 틀리고 그 논쟁을 뭐 하는 자리가 아니고 좀 효율적이고 합리적인 방법으로 그 선수들이 훈련하는 방법을 제시하는 시간이 되겠습니다.
Actually, we are going to have a 4 session of YouTube live from today, and then I would like to have this YouTube live session for the way to have the efficient to make some conversation about the efficient and the reasonable training method for our competitor instead of any debate or the controversial issue.
저도 이제 처음으로 해보는 유튜브 방송이고 경험도 없고 또 저희도 많은 인원들과 많은 장비와 또 많은 자료를 가지고 이렇게 하지만은 처음 하는 일이다 보니까 실수도 있고 좀 매끄럽지 못할 것 같습니다.
Actually, it is the very first time to have this kind of a YouTube live to us as well. So we try to use a lot of manpower and the equipment and the material for giving this lecture to you. But we have quite a lack of experience in this situation. So please understand the whole of the things.
오늘 이제 1차 방송이 끝나면은 이제 문제점이라든가 개선점을 찾아서 2차 때부터는 좀 더 향상되고 발전된 모습으로 2차 방송을 대비하도록 하겠습니다.
So we are going to make up for our problem or if there is any improvement point, we would like to cover all of that after finishing this first session of YouTube Live.
그러면 저희가 동영상을 12편을 제작했는데 그 내용을 간략하게 좀 설명을 드리겠습니다. 제 화면, 노트북 화면 좀
까지
부탁드리겠습니다.
의료비 지원
We
대상으로
made
확정된
the 12 series
인원은 총
of lecture and
17명이며
video
이 중
clip previously.
지원을
So we are going to
기마치신
give you a
네
brief
분에 대해서는 의료비
introduction
지원이
about each
완료되었습니다.
video clip.
다른 대상자분들도
네, 저희가
관할
이제
시군구
비디오를
보고서를 통해
12편을
지원을
제작했는데요.
신청하시면 신속하게 지원해드릴
So we
예정입니다.
made 12
다음은
series of the video
코로나19 국외
clip in
발생
total.
동향 말씀드리겠습니다.
제 1편이
전 세계 코로나19 발생이
냉동 공구
7주 연속
사용법과 관리에
증가하였으며
대해서
특히 델타 변이 영향으로
내용이 있습니다.
미국, 이스라엘,
The
일본
first
등에서
video
발생이
clip is
크게
about
증가하고
how to
있습니다.
use and manage
최근
tools.
일주간 전
두 번째가 냉동 배관 제작 과정이고요.
And the second one is about the refrigeration piping manufacturing process.
그다음에 3차 시가 냉동 배관 그 브레이징에 대해서 이제 설명을 드리고 있습니다.
And then the third lesson is about the brazing work for the refrigeration piping.
그다음에 4차 시가 질소 가압 및 진공 시험.
Fourth video clip is about the pressure test and the evacuation test.
그다음에 5차 시가 냉매 주의 및 전기 연속성과 절연 검사.
The fifth sessions of the video clip is about charging refrigerant into the refrigeration cycle and then testing electrical continuity and the insulation resistance.
그다음에 6차 시가 이제 압력 스위치, 그러니까 프레셔 스위치라든가 서머 템퍼레처 세팅하는 방법에 대해서 6차 시를 설명하겠습니다. 동영상이 있습니다.
The sixth video clip is about explaining how to set pressure switch and thermostat.
7차 시는 시운전 및 테스트 시트 작성이 되겠습니다.
The next one going to be about commissioning the refrigeration system and completing the test project sheet.
다음에 8차 시는 이제 8차 시부터 이제 고장 진단이 되겠습니다. 그래서 에어컨 고장 진단인데 전기 쪽 고장 진단이 되겠습니다.
The next one is going to be about the fault finding parts, but the first session for the fault finding is about the electrical part in the air conditioning unit.
9차 시는 에어컨 고장 진단에서 고압이 높은 경우에 대해서 고압 쪽 고압 이상이 생겼을 때 진단 방법에 대해서 설명을 하고 있습니다.
Next one is about examining the mechanical fault in the air conditioning unit when there is some problem in the high pressure part.
그다음에 이제 10차 시가 에어컨 고장 진단인데 저압이 정상 운전 중에 이제 저압이 낮아졌을 때 고장을 진단하는 방법이 되겠습니다.
So next one is about examining the mechanical fault in the air conditioning unit, especially when there is some problem in the low pressure part. For example, the pressure is getting low.
그다음에 11, 12차 시는 이제 고장난 부품을 수리하는 그 수리 과정을 2차 시로 나누어서 1, 2로 되겠습니다.
And then the last two video clips about the procedure for repairing the mechanical fault in the air conditioning. We are going to have two separate sessions for giving you the lecture about this.
오늘은 1회차로서 이제 오늘 첫날이 첫 이제 라이브 방송인데요. 오늘은 2차 시, 3차 시, 4차 시에 관한 내용으로 여러분과 만나게 되겠습니다.
So this is our first session of YouTube Live. So we are going to cover the second and third and the fourth video lecturing video clips.
다음에 2회차에서는 이제 4, 5, 6차 시 프레셔 테스트, 이바큐um 테스트, 그다음에 5차, 6차 시까지를 계획을 잡고 있습니다.
So our second round for the YouTube live session is going to cover the video clip number 4, 5, 6.
3회차는 시운전 및 테스트 시스 작성과 에어컨 고장 진단 방법에 대해서 설명을 드리도록 하겠습니다.
The third round of the YouTube live is going to be about the video clip number 7 and 8. So commissioning and the fault finding part.
4회차는 에어컨 고장 진단 및 수리에 대해서 전체적으로 설명을 드리는 시간을 갖겠습니다.
So the last session is going to be fourth round of our YouTube live. So it's going to be about the fault finding part. So it's going to be covering from video clip number 9 to 12.
오늘은 이제 2, 3, 4차 시 배관, 냉동 배관과 브레이징, 그다음에 프레셔 테스트 그거에 관한 유튜브 동영상을 먼저 시청하시고 그 내용을 제가 간략히 설명드리고 질문사항을 받고 설명드리도록 하겠습니다. 유튜브.
So today's YouTube live session is a first round. So we are going to cover the video clip number 2 to number 4 is about the refrigeration piping manufacturing and brazing and pressure test and the evacuation test. So we are going to show you the brief video clip about our lecture, and then I'm going to give you the brief lecturing about our video clip, and we are going to take a Q&A time.
그럼 동영상은 여기서 제가 틀까요? 아니면 그쪽에서 그쪽에서 드리겠습니다. 네.
Now we are going to show you our video clip for today's lecture.
안에 통산 두 번째로 슈퍼컵을 들어올리는
Please check what you are going to perform on this
슈퍼스타
test.
리오넬 메시를
Performing
떠나보낸
tasks.
FC 바르셀로나의 구단 가치가 급락했습니다. 스페인 언론들은 바르셀로나의 브랜드 가치가 기존 12억 6,600만 유로에서 약 11%, 1억 3,700만 유로, 우리 돈으로 약 1,855억
Reading the
원이
drawings.
감소할 것이라고 보도했습니다.
Based on the given
바르셀로나는
drawings,
그동안 1위
figure out
레알
what materials
마드리드에
and
이어
components
구단
are required.
가치에서 2위에 올라
Straight
있습니다.
tasks. Reading the drawings. Based on the given drawings, figure out what materials and components are required. Straighten the coiled copper tube in order to cut it as much as needed. Cut the copper tube longer than actually required to spare enough margin. Straighten the copper tube after cutting it so that it has no dents. When straightening the copper tube, make your arms at a right angle and press it down using your body weight as if pressing it down with your chest. To apply force evenly to the copper tube, rub it using the curve between index and middle finger on your palm. Reasons the copper tube needs to be straightened. All of the tubes and piping should remain vertical or horizontal. If the copper tube is not straightened, it is hard to maintain the tube vertically or horizontally when bending the tube. It can also cause a deformation, such as a distortion. The characteristics of copper tube used for the refrigerant piping. It has excellent corrosion resistance and durability. It reduces a friction loss due to its smooth interior. It has low scale formation. It is easy to fabricate or install piping due to its excellent ductility. It is thin and light-weighted, so it can reduce the weight of piping. It has a disadvantage of being easily dented by force as it is thin. Bending the copper tube. Take a measurement for part to be bent and put marks on the copper tube. When putting marks on the copper tube, it should be drawn as thin as possible to reduce error in dimension.
끝이 뾰족한 금극기 도구를 사용해 마킹해 줍니다.
Match the marking point to the zero mark on the form wheel and the form lever of bender.
표시된 0점을 함께 일치시킵니다.
After that, bend the tube as much as the desired angle. When bending the copper tube into 90 degrees according to the drawing, a competitor should calculate the dimension of the part where the bending should be started. The competitor's current situation. The competitor puts a mark on the tube according to the dimension, 100 millimeters, shown in the drawing. The competitor matches the marking point to the zero marks on the bender and then bends the tube. After bending the tube into 90 degrees, the copper tube gets lengthened. The length of copper tube after bending, 124 millimeters. The bent part of tube gets lengthened as much as the radius of bender. Bender type. Elongated length depending on the bender type. 1/4 inch, 14 millimeters, 3/8 inch, 24 millimeters, 1/2 inch, 38 millimeters.
가 늘어나는 것을 확인할 수 있습니다.
To follow the dimension in the drawing, the starting point for bending should be adjusted to the resulting value of subtracting the radius of bender from the entire length.
8분의 3 동작
Entire length, 100 millimeters. Starting point for bending, marking point, equals entire length minus radius of bender.
4mm를 빼준 76mm가 됩니다. 이 마킹점을 밴딩기의 0 표시에 맞추어 밴딩해주면 원하는 전체 치수를 맞출 수 있습니다.
When using the bender, it is easier to refer to the RL mark for the adjustment.
맞출 수 있는데요.
L mark, stand for left.
쪽의 약자이고
R mark, stand for right.
쪽의 약자입니다.
If using the LR mark, there is no need to set any tolerance when bending the tube.
할 수 있습니다.
Use the L mark if the end of the pipe, the point where you started measuring 100 millimeters, is on the left side.
사용합니다.
If you bend the tube after matching the point where you put a 100 millimeter mark to the L mark, it is possible to bend the tube into 90 degrees with a desired length along its central axis. Use the R mark if the end of the pipe, the point where you started measuring 100 millimeters, is on the right side. And make sure the point where you put a 100 millimeter mark is matched to the R mark when bending. The refrigerant piping should be bent so that no stress is caused at the connecting parts after installation. Trying to bend the tube with a single motion can easily cause several defects, making the bent part get dented or flattened.
되기 쉬워집니다.
When bending the tube, do it as slowly as possible so that the tube does not get distorted. Make sure a joining part of the tube maintains a circular shape without any dents. If working with the typically used mechanical tube bender, you can bend the tube at various angles, 45 degrees, 90 degrees, 180 degrees, 360 degrees, etc., and directions. Applying a tolerance when cutting the copper tube and giving a finish.
단하고 끝손질을 합니다.
When using a copper tube cutter, use your right hand to turn the handle clockwise and rotate the cutter from inside to outside for cutting the tube. Use your left hand to prevent the cutter from falling off the tube as it rotates around the tube.
역할을 합니다.
The copper tube used for the refrigerant piping is thin and light-weighted, so it is easily dented by force. Make several turns to cut the tube gradually instead of cutting it deeply with a single turn.
서서히 절단합니다.
Although the tube is cut successfully, there might be a little distortion and burrs around the cut edge.
거스러미가 생기게 됩니다.
Remove all burrs and the distorted parts using a file and a reamer.
제거해 주어야 합니다.
Hold the copper tube above the tool to keep the removed burrs from getting into the tube.
안으로 들어가지 않게 주의합니다.
If some metal crumbs from cutting or filing, reaming procedure remains inside the tube, it might cause a resistance in the refrigerant flow or a blockage by debris.
발생할 수 있습니다.
Flow the nitrogen gas to remove all the debris that might remain inside the tube.
제거합니다.
Flaring the tube. Trim the part to be flared with a reamer and a file. The two ends of the tube should be in perfect parallel to each other. What is the tube flaring? It is to form the end of the tube into a flared shape and then connect the flare nut and the double nipple fittings together. The flare-shaped tube acts as a sealing, which enables the high-pressured airtight state maintained. It is always necessary to flare the bent tube after fitting the flare nut to it.
후에 플레어링합니다.
This is because the flare nut cannot be fitted afterwards if the bent tube has already been flared. Insert the copper tube into the corresponding hole in the die block of the flaring tool. When inserting the tube into the hole, set 1/3 of the part where it will be flared to stick out of the block, and then tighten the tube so that it does not get slipped out. If the tube sticks too much out of the block, the diameter of the flare becomes too large, so the flare nut cannot be fitted. If the tube fails to stick out of the block, the diameter of the flare becomes too small, so the tube gets slipped out from the flare nut when tightening the flare nut. The flared part should be between 75% and 100% of its joining surface. Flare the tube rotating the handle of the flaring tool and drawing the cone of the flaring tool slowly into the end of the tube. If the flared surface is ragged or has some debris on it, there is a chance of leakage. Therefore, it is necessary to check how the flaring is done, the size of the flared part and any burst, and clean it well. Bring the flared surface to the double nipple fittings and then tighten the flare nut to connect them together. To prevent the leakage of refrigerant, the sealing oil should be applied to all the flared connecting parts of the piping before the final assembly. When tightening the flare nut, use adjustable wrenches to hold both the flare nut and the double nipple fittings at the same time. If you hold only one side, the other side, which is not fixed, could rotate along as you tighten, causing some distortions. Expanding the copper tube. What is the copper tube expansion? It is to expand a soft copper tube which has the same diameter as others to create a socket without using connecting bolts and nuts. It is commonly used in the field when connecting copper tubes to extend the length because there is no need to use any additional components. You can use a flaring tool for this expanding operation, but an expander can also be used. Bring the expander to a halt. Insert the copper tube into the first groove, slightly expanding the front part of the tube. Then, insert the tube all the way into the expander dice. Operate the expander over 3 to 4 time trials to create the socket part gradually. Slowly turn the copper tube clockwise to deliver the force evenly to the tube.
힘이 전달될 수 있도록 합니다.
If you try to expand the tube with a single strong movement, the end of the tube might be burst. If this happens, the tube cannot be connected to another tube. Regarding to the expansion length, the overlapped part should be longer than 1/2 of the tube's diameter for tubes to be connected safely.
안전한 이음이 이루어집니다.
Work.
이번 과제
Please check what you are going to perform on this task. Basic brazing method.
방법을 훈련합니다.
Prepare necessary tools and materials for brazing, such as a gas welder. Check the pressure of oxygen, acetylene, and nitrogen. Control the pressure of the oxygen and acetylene gauge in the oxygen-acetylene gas welder. Adjust the pressure to 0.5 kilograms per centimeter squared for acetylene and 5 kilograms per centimeter squared for oxygen. Examine the connecting parts of gas torch and gauge hoses to check if there is any leakage using soapy water. Ignite the gas torch to neutral flame.
중성 불꽃으로 조절합니다.
After heating up the joint, braze it using a silver brazing rod. If the copper tube, which is the base metal, reaches the appropriate temperature, apply the silver brazing rod to the joint. As the end of the silver brazing rod gets melted down into the joint, the joining part is connected. Make sure the silver brazing metal does not overflow to the tube or any other components. Be sure the silver brazing metal is not deposited too widely. If the silver brazing metal is not deposited sufficiently, the brazed surface will not be even and the joint will not be connected properly. To produce properly brazed surfaces, the silver brazing metal must be sufficiently applied to more than 2/3 of the expanded section. If the flame is too strong or the copper tube is heated up too long, it can cause the copper tube, which is the base metal, to get melted. Therefore, competitors should be able to braze the tube in a short amount of time through practice. Before the brazing work, flow the nitrogen gas inside the copper tube. Afterwards, keep flowing the nitrogen gas as you perform the brazing work. Comparing two different copper tubes. One is brazed with flowing the nitrogen gas. The other is brazed without flowing the nitrogen gas. When you cut the brazed joint of the copper tube that is brazed without flowing the nitrogen gas, you can check its inner part is blackened. This is because the oxidation occurred inside the tube caused by the heat inflicted when brazing. If the oxidation occurs or any other impurities remain inside the tube, it can cause some problems in piping. When brazing pipes, it is necessary to flow the nitrogen gas. Basic brazing work for the refrigeration piping. Prepare necessary tools for brazing, such as a gas welder. Check the pressure of oxygen, acetylene, and nitrogen, and control the pressure of each gauge. For the safety of the competitor, check whether the backfire protector is attached to the acetylene cylinder gauge. Examine the connecting parts of gas torch and gauge hoses to check if there is any leakage using soapy water. Open the nitrogen gauge and set the pressure to 0.2 kilograms per centimeter squared. Polish the joint of the copper tube. In order to enhance the fluidity of the brazing rod, wipe the exterior of pipes with sandpaper or nylon cloth. Competitors can wipe the interior of pipes with a piece of cloth or flow the nitrogen gas to remove impurities. In order to connect the tubes with the same radius without a socket, the joint of one tube must have been expanded with a tube expander for easier brazing. Insert the copper tube to be brazed into the expanded tube. When joining two copper tubes which have the same quality of the material, it is fine not to use flux. Fix the copper tube to be brazed with a vise. Posture for the brazing work. The competitors can take the most comfortable posture and fix the tube according to the desired posture. Flow nitrogen gas inside the copper tube to be brazed. Ignite the gas torch to neutral flame. Heat up the joining part. If there is a chance of overheating the tube due to its small diameter, heat it up with weak carburizing flame, while making sure not to melt the copper tube. The plenty of practice is required since competitors need to control the flame properly and heat the joint evenly. Conduct brazing using a brazing rod. If the copper tube, which is the base metal, reaches the appropriate temperature, apply the brazing rod to the joint. As the end of the brazing rod gets melted down into the joint, the joining part is connected. When brazing, be careful not to cause fire because of the flame. Competitors must always wear welding leather gloves when working. It is not allowed to carry a brazing torch around when it is ignited or leave the torch ignited for the upcoming work. Make sure not to get burnt from the heated copper tube after the brazing work. What is brazing? It is a technique of connecting two base metals by melting another metal or alloy which has a lower melting point than the base metal and applying heat without harming the base metal. Brazing is one of the most important processes in copper tube construction. It is used to connect tube to tube or tube to fittings used for welding. When flowing the brazing rod into the joint, check the connecting joint and fill in sufficient amount of brazing rod. Finalize the work by overlapping the start and the end of the joint for it to be airtight. However, make sure the deposited silver brazing metal does not overflow to the pipe or any other components. Be sure the deposited metal does not be applied too widely. If the heating temperature on the copper tubes is too low, the brazing rod will not melt, making it hard and time-consuming to join the metal. The principle of brazing. It makes use of wetting and capillary action. What is wetting? When liquid is in contact with a solid surface, the liquid spreads over the solid surface due to intermolecular interactions between the two. This is called wetting. If wetting does not occur, it is impossible to braze. For the wetting process to occur easily, the surface of the base metal should be clean without any corrosion or contamination, and needs proper solvent, brazing rod, and heating temperature. Capillary action refers to the ability of a liquid to flow in thin pipes or narrow spaces due to wetting. If the heating temperature is adequate and the gap between the joints is sufficiently small to make the cohesion within the liquid be weaker than the adhesive forces between the liquid and the solid, then the surface tension penetrates into capillary to draw up the brazing rod. On the other hand, if the heating temperature is inadequate and the gap between the joints is too wide to make the cohesion stronger than the adhesive forces, then the liquid surface in the capillary will fall down, causing the brazing rod to fall down as well. Therefore, when brazing, adequate heating temperature and the gap between the joints is very crucial. The most appropriate gap width is 0.04 to 0.2 millimeters for the capillary action to take place. When brazing is over, turn off the flame and wait until the brazing at the joint harden and be fixed. When brazing is over, lock the main gas valve and release the remaining gas in the torch and the gas hose. Brazing the actual refrigerant pipe of air conditioner. Check the part where the refrigerant pipe is dented and using a tube cutter with the right diameter, locate the cutting wheel, which plays a role of bladder, to the point where it is to be cut, and while rotating the cutter, cut the pipe. Copper tube used for refrigerant piping is thin and light, making it easy to be crushed by force. Cut both sides of the dented part. Measure the length of the part where it is dented and cut a new copper tube for replacement. Although the pipe is cut successfully, there might occur some distortion and burrs around the cut edge. Remove all distorted parts around the cut using a file and a reamer. Connect the yellow hose, which is a surface hose of the manifold gauge, to the nitrogen gas cylinder. The nitrogen gas cylinder is highly pressured, so make sure to install a decompression device before using it. Connect each hose of the manifold and check whether the connecting points are secured according to regulations. Use soapy water to check for any leakage. Use a copper tube expander for expanding the tube. Connect a new copper tube to where it is cut and remove foreign substances attached around. If you conduct brazing on site, flame retardant curtains should be installed to prevent damages on tubes caused by torch fire. If you conduct brazing to connect parts that are vulnerable to high temperature, use a wet cloth to cool down the brazed parts and complete the work as quickly as possible. Before brazing, wear welding leather gloves and open the high-pressure valve of oxygen and acetylene cylinder to check the operating pressure. Open torch valve to ignite fire and control flare to neutral flame. Neutral flame is when the long wing-shaped white flame becomes shorter and the center of the flame is surrounded by blue-colored flame. When the tube or the part to be brazed is heated up sufficiently to reach the melting point of the brazing rod, start brazing. Even when you ventilate nitrogen gas into the refrigeration system, if there is any remaining air, you must not start brazing. You should start if the nitrogen gas is being ventilated thoroughly. Even when nitrogen is being ventilated, make sure you seal the entrance so that air does not go into the refrigeration system. After brazing is complete, lock the high-pressure valve of oxygen and acetylene cylinder and release the remaining gas in the torch and gas hoses. Please check what you are going to perform on this task. Examine the pressure of refrigerant piping with nitrogen pressurization. Connect the yellow surface hose of the manifold gauge to the nitrogen gas cylinder. Before the nitrogen pressurization, open all valves in the refrigeration unit so that there are no obstruction. Open all the solenoid valves that only open through electricity by using the solenoid valve opening magnet. You cannot use the general magnet at this time. The blue hose of the manifold gauge should be connected to the low pressure port, and the red hose should be connected to the high pressure port. What is manifold gauge? The manifold gauge consists of two gauges, two passive valves, and three separated connecting hoses. It is used in many different tasks for a refrigeration system, including evacuation test, refrigerant charge, refrigerant recovery, all sorts of pressure tests, as well as a nitrogen pressure test. When using a manifold gauge, there should be no filth around the hoses and the connecting parts. There should be no moisture and air inside the hoses as well. Control the pressure of the nitrogen gauge. The nitrogen gas cylinder is high pressured, so you must control the pressure through the gauge, which is equipped with a decompression device. Before the pressure test, check if there is any signs of leakage on the connecting parts of the manifold gauge and nitrogen gauge, and any other area that is prone to leakage with a soapy water. When conducting a leakage test, you should place a dry cloth underneath to prevent soapy water from dripping onto the floor. Open high and low pressure valves so that the nitrogen gas can be pressurized into the refrigeration unit. When opening and closing the valves of the manifold gauge, turn them slowly to make sure strong pressure is not applied abruptly on the gauge. The nitrogen pressure should be based on the low pressure gauge of the manifold gauge. The nitrogen must be pressurized up to the suggested standard in the competition. When pressurizing the nitrogen gas, the pressurization should be conducted slowly for safety. What is a nitrogen pressure test? The nitrogen pressure test refers to a test to check if there's any leakage while the pressure vessels such as compressor and a condenser is connected to the valve after pipe work is finished. After pressurizing the nitrogen gas up to the standardized point, you should inspect every connecting parts with soap water. There also should be no drop in pressure on the pressure gauge for a certain period of time. Nitrogen gas is used for a pressure test. The reason for using the nitrogen gas is because nitrogen gas is a chemically stable gas and has no danger of explosion even when it is mixed with other substances, and it can be pressurized at high pressure, and the pressure is less likely to change due to the ambient temperature. The reason for not using the air is because the air contains some moisture itself. If air gets pressured, the moisture in the air starts to condense, which can cause a failure during operation. When the nitrogen pressure inside the device reaches the standard point, close the valves of the nitrogen cylinder and the manifold gauge. While keeping the pressure for the leakage test, check for leakage in all possible areas such as the brazed parts and nut fitting parts with soapy water. There should be no leakage in all of the inspected area. After the nitrogen pressure test is finished, leave the refrigeration unit for a certain amount of time and check if there is any pressure drops. You can move on to the next step after no leakage is verified. After leaving the refrigeration unit for a certain period of time, discharge the nitrogen gas in the equipment towards the service hose by opening the high and low pressure valves of the manifold gauge. When discharging the nitrogen gas, you should not discharge it into the air, especially to the upper side of the liquid receiver. Just as pressurizing, the gas must be discharged slowly in extremely small amounts to prevent safety accidents. Check whether the nitrogen is completely discharged through the scales on the manifold gauge. Check if all needles of the gauge indicate 0. Disconnect the nitrogen cylinder from the system and seal all connecting parts that are open to the outside, such as valves and pipe ends, with service caps. After completing the pressure test, have the completion verified. This is an evacuation test using a vacuum pump. Check the required tools for the evacuation test. The required tools are a vacuum pump, a vacuum gauge, a manifold gauge, and etc. For the evacuation test, open all valves of the equipment. What is an evacuation test? The evacuation test is to remove the non-condensing gas or moisture remaining inside the refrigerator and inspect the device for leakage before charging the refrigerant after the leakage test. Connect the vacuum gauge to the vacuum pump and turn the power on the vacuum pump, then check whether the value of the vacuum gauge decreases below 1000 microns. The vacuum pump serves to remove any remaining moisture, air, and non-condensable gas inside the refrigeration system. When using a vacuum pump, you should place it on an even surface. Before using the pump, check whether the oil is at the normal oil level through the gradation of oil level gauge. The ability of the vacuum pump is judged by its discharging capacity. The bigger capacity the vacuum pump has, more time can be saved for the evacuation task. It is important to choose the appropriate vacuum pump with the corresponding capacity depending on the task. If you use a vacuum pump with small capacity compared to the task, the spent time gets longer and the lifespan of vacuum pump can be shortened. What is vacuum gauge? It indicates the evacuation level of the system being evacuated. For now, check whether the vacuum gauge indicates the desired vacuum level based on the standard point designated in the task. After the gauge efficiency test, connect the vacuum gauge to the refrigeration unit. The vacuum gauge should be installed as far away from the vacuum pump as possible. However, where the vacuum gauge should be installed might vary depending on tasks of competition. During evacuating, you cannot use the high vacuum hose that is installed to the vacuum pump. Instead, connect the service hose of the manifold gauge to the suction part of the vacuum pump. Open low and high pressure valves of the manifold gauge. Open all sorts of valves inside the refrigeration system. Turn on the vacuum pump to run it, and open the high and low pressure valves of the manifold gauge. Start the evacuation process and aim to be below 1000 microns before the time given for the task is over. If the evacuation level does not be below 1000 microns, you should keep going until it reaches the desired state. Evacuating the system is necessary for charging refrigerant and normal operation of the refrigeration system. If the evacuation reaches the desired state, close the high and low pressure valve of the manifold gauge. Stop the vacuum pump and remove the manifold gauge hose from the vacuum pump. If the vacuum gauge and the vacuum pump are too close, the evacuation state inside the refrigeration system cannot be accurately measured due to the influence of the vacuum pump nearby. Leave the refrigeration unit in the evacuation state for a certain amount of time, which is suggested in the competition. You can start the evacuation test whenever they want, based on what is favorable to them. If you fail to leave the refrigeration unit in the evacuated state, they can pressurize the nitrogen gas again to find a leaking part. Precautions for evacuation are as follows. Make the length of the hose you're using to be as short as possible. If the hose is old, or if there's any leakage in the connected part, the evacuation process will not go well or take too much time. If the rubber packing inside the joint of the manifold gauge hose has worn out, the evacuation process will not go well because of leakage. Be sure to exchange the rubber packing with a new one. In particular, if steam is coming out from the vacuum pump outlet, there is a big chance of air coming in from the connecting parts. You should take measures to solve this. If the evacuation level does not change even when you have run the vacuum pump for more than 30 minutes, you should check the ability of the vacuum pump or any leakage in the system. In normal working conditions, 30 minutes of evacuation should give you a certain evacuation level. If the evacuation level does not change even after leaving the refrigeration unit for a certain amount of time, charge refrigerant to more than atmospheric pressure to prevent non-condensable gas from being mixed. When charging refrigerant, the pressure shown on gauge should be as low as around 0.5 kilograms per centimeter squared. The charged refrigerant should be recorded and then totaled up afterwards.
네, 잘 보셨나요?
Well, that's all about the video clip, what we prepared. Did you guys see it properly?
혹시 지금 저희가 이게 다른 분들도 들어오신 걸 볼 수 있나요? 유튜브에 좀 들어오신 분들도 질문을 좀 받을 수 있으면 받았으면 좋겠는데 지금 보시고 질문 사항이 있으시면 한번 질문을 받고 싶습니다.
Actually, we would like to have the Q&A time straight away after finishing the video clip, so we might need some time to check the questions on the YouTube live streaming chat.
아니 뭐 저걸 좀 알려 주실 수 있나요? 그 우리 줌 주소를 좀.
Or maybe we have another option to share our Zoom link, and then if you guys have any questions about video clip or anything else, you can join in Zoom with us, and then you can also ask your questions through the Zoom chat.
네, 그 준비가 되는 동안 잠시 제가 좀 우리 비디오에 대해서 좀 설명을 좀 드릴게요.
So actually, I think we need some time to get prepared for some Q&A time. So I'm going to give you a brief explanation about our video clip today.
저희가 지금 동영상 2, 3, 4차시는 어떻게 보면은 국제대회를 처음 참가하거나 그 준비하는 그 신생 국가들의 참고를 위해서 지금 제작을 했다고 보시면 되겠습니다.
Actually, the video clip from number 2 to 4. So we preparing this whole video clip for helping the competitors or the new countries who join in world scale competition in the first time.
어떻게 보면 가장 기본적이고 저희 회의에 참석할 수 있는 줌 주소는 그 유튜브 채널에 올려놨다니까 한번 참고하시고 질문 사항 있으면 질문 주시면 고맙겠습니다.
Actually, we already share our Zoom link or ID and a password on the live streaming channel. So if you'd like to join with us through the Zoom, you can just check that.
예, 다시 원래 돌아가서 이제 지금 저희가 2, 3차, 3, 4차시까지는 오늘 지금 하는 차시는 주로 이제 신생 처음으로 국제대회를 참여하던가 참여한 지 얼마 안 되는, 그리고 또 오랜 참여가 있는 국가 선수들도 반드시 지켜야 되고 기본적으로 알아야 될 사항을 아주 중요한 내용들이라고 볼 수 있습니다.
Our first live streaming session, which covers the video clip from number 2 to 4, covering very basic and important contents for the refrigeration skills. So it is quite helpful for the new competitor or the new countries who join in world scale competition first time, or even you are an existing competitor, you also can have the very important content from our video as well.
저희 내용을 다시 한번 되짚어 보면은 그 가장 중요한 게 동관을 그 펴는 곧게 펴는 이렇게 작업이 제일 중요하고요.
So the first important thing is to straighten the copper tube, the pipe.
예, 곧게 펴지 않으면은 나중에 밴딩했을 때 그 정확하게 90도가 안 나온다든가 수직 배관이 그 곧게 수직이 안 되고 수평 배관도 곧게 수평이 안 되고 하기 때문에 그 처음에 그 동관 펴는 작업이 되게 중요합니다.
So it is very important to straighten the pipe and then the copper tube in the first time, because if you don't straight the copper tube properly, you cannot bend the pipe as the 90 degrees of angle, or it cannot maintain the vertical or horizontal lines when it inserts on the refrigeration system.
예, 이런 작업이 어떻게 보면 상당히 기본적이고 중요하지 않을 것 같지만은 우리가 이제 어떤 좋은 결과를 얻기 위해서는 이런 기본적인 그 작업이 되게 중요하고요.
So it looks like it's very basic, so it can be ignored sometimes, but it is a very important procedure during the whole the refrigeration and air conditioning skills procedure. So make sure to remember this procedure.
그다음에 이제 밴딩 할 때 이제 밴딩을 어떻게 치수를 어떻게 맞추고 어떻게 밴딩을 해야 되고 R 포지션이 뭐고 L 포지션이 뭐고 예, 그런 거에 대해서 설명을 했고요.
And then next, we also gave you the explanation about bending. So for example, how to measure the diameter or measurement for bending, or we also let you know the how to bend the pipe, and then even the way how to adjust the R or L mark on the bender.
그다음에 동 커팅을 동 커터는 어떤 식으로 사용을 하고 어떻게 작업을 해야 되는지 설명을 드렸고요.
And then we also gave you the explanation about how to use the cutter and then how to cut the copper tube by using the cutter.
그다음에 리머 작업을 할 때 리머를 작업할 동관이 상향으로 되고 하향으로 됐으면 그 이물질이 안으로 들어가니까 그걸 방지하기 위해서 동관을 상향으로 들어주는 그런 포인트가 있었고요.
We also highlighted the point about the reaming procedure. So when you conduct the reaming procedure, you need to make sure the copper tube upside down to prevent the debris or the impurities get inside.
그다음에 파일 작업해가지고 그 이물질 동 커터 작업했을 때 수평으로 그 작업 프레아가 될 수 있게끔 작업하는 그런 그 파이얼 작업을 또 보여드렸고요.
We also show you and explain how to conduct the flying procedure. So when you files the copper tube, so you need to make sure it's helpful to the flaring procedure later, making the even the circular the end of the copper tube.
플레어링 할 때 그 접속을 좋게 하기 위해서 플레어링 오일을 바르는 것도 아마 보셨을 겁니다.
You also can watch the procedure about applying the sealing oil to help connecting the flaring nut and then the fittings.
예, 잠깐만 우리 그 SCM 들어왔는데 로엘. Hello, 로엘.
Sorry, wait a moment. We just can't see the Mr. Noels from our screen, our SCM. Hello.
안 들리나요?
Noel, can you hear us?
들리나 보다. Thank you, 로엘.
Thank you for joining us, Noel.
잠깐 로엘 저희하고 연결될 수 있을까요? 인사 잠깐 하고 했으면 좋겠는데.
And also, if would you mind turning on your microphone to speak to us a little bit?
오케이. 진행하겠습니다.
Okay, no, could we just go on the next step?
오늘 어쨌든 그 로얄 우리 SCM이 들어와서 저로서는 많이 응원이 되고 너무 감사드립니다.
It's really happy to see our SCM Noah in this Zoom meeting, and then it is very cheerful for me.
오, 들린다.
Yes, we can hear you.
인사 한번 해달라고 하죠.
Is it okay you say hello to the president, to people who join Zoom meeting with us briefly, if you don't mind?
이게 딜레이가 많구나.
Hello, everybody.
끝.
Is that it?
오케이. 다음에 다시 한번 로얄 한번 연결하겠습니다.
Okay, I will ask you your help if I really need later.
그다음에 이제 동관 작업이 되면 이제 다 조립이 되면은 저희가 이제 브레이징을 해야 되는데 이제 브레이징 하는 방법 또 그 불을 어떻게 쓰는지 그 또 브레이징 하기 전에 그 이물질을 제거하기 위해서 브레이징 부위를 사포 이렇게 이물질을 제거하는 작업 또 어떻게 불을 써야 되는지 또 어떤 작업이 그 우리가 원하는 훌륭한 작업인지를 그 동영상을 통해 보여드렸습니다.
And then next is about the brazing procedure. So after connecting all the parts of the cooper tube, and then we need to do the brazing. So we already gave you some explanation about how to use the gas torch for the brazing, and then before conducting the brazing, you make sure to apply some sandpaper for making clear all around of the cooper tube
용접 부위.
to remove the debris. And then we also gave you the best example of the brazing.
예, 저희도 그 많은 선수들이 훈련하고 있는데 가장 큰 고민거리하고 그 어떤 우리의 그 목표이자 또 우리의 어떤 잘 해결되지 않는 부분이 이 브레이징 작업인 것 같습니다.
I think all of the competitor, including Korea competitor, having some issue or the difficulty in conducting the brazing job for doing very well this.
이제 브레이징 다음에 저희가 이제 보여드린 게 이제 질소 값, 질소 테스트, 압력 테스트 및 이제 바큐um 테스트를 보여드렸고요, 동영상을.
And then after the brazing procedure, we also gave you the explanation about our pressure test and then the evacuation test.
예, 질소는 저희가 이제 압력이 상당히 높기 때문에 카스텐, 헬로, 부심사장도 들어왔다. 그것도 다 관심사 들어왔다. 예.
딜레이가 조금.
네, 개인적으로 우리 저 SCM하고 또 데프트 칩 우리 카스텐 들어와가지고 많은 위로가 되고 힘이 됩니다. 또 좀 부끄럽기도 하네요, 조금.
Now I got additional strength from the Karsten, our deputy chiefs. Once again, thank you for joining with our SCM Noel and our deputy chief Karsten, and it was quite helpful to me, and somehow a little bit nervous to having a lecture in front of you guys.
카스텐, say hello.
Okay. If you activate the microphones, so unmute, you can speak, Karsten.
오케이, 카스텐 준비되는 동안 조금 진행하겠습니다.
So waiting for the Karsten's ready, so you're going to move to the next step for our brief explanation about video clip.
지금 보면 이거를 잠깐 보여줄 수 있나요? 제 아이패드로 한번 보여줄 수 있나요?
I would like to share
저기
some files, the diagram.
아니면은 이걸로 보여줘도 되나요? 노트북으로? 아니 요걸로 할게요. 요걸로. 여기 튀어나와가지고. 들리기 시작했고.
네.
안 들려.
네, 강의 일단 열어주셔서 감사하고 오늘 잠깐 참가자들도 환영하고 또 인터넷에 공개될 강의를 잘 활용해서 우리 상황을 월드스케일 잘 준비할 수 있도록 도와주셨으면 좋겠다고 말씀드립니다.
Thank you, 카스텐. 지금 우리 이제 혹시 여기까지 질문 있으시면은 저기 선수나 아니면 다른 나라 엑스퍼트들 질문 있으면 질문을 받고 질문이 없으면 제가 추가 설명을 드리겠습니다.
Before starting the additional explanation, any expert or any competitor, if you have any questions about today's lecture or video clip, feel free to ask any question to us. Maybe you can leave your questions on the Zoom chat, or you can ask through the audio.
이걸 어떻게 볼 수 있는 방법은 없나요?
화면이요?
아니 그러니까 지금 질문 내용이라든가 이런 거 볼 수 있는 방법이 없는 거죠.
질문 내용은 일단은 유튜브는 지금 불가능하고요. 줌으로는 확인이 가능합니다.
오케이. 이게 사실 만나서 하면 되게 좋은데 이게 영상으로 하려니까 좀 어려운 기술적인 문제가 좀 많이 있습니다.
Actually, as you guys know that if we are not going to have this kind of a technical issue, if we have some conversation or the meeting through the offline, but it is an online situation, so we have a little bit issue regarding to the technical thing.
예, 우리가 이제 오늘 그 주제가 그 질소과합하고 이제 진공이 있기 때문에 거기에 대해서 좀 보충 설명을 좀 드리겠습니다.
So actually, we are also dealing with the procedure for the pressure test and the evacuation test today. So I would like to give you the additional explanation about this.
예, 우리가 지지난 대회까지는 그 매일 일정별로 어떤 그 작업 완료 기준이 없었는데 지난 카잔 대회부터는 그 대회 날짜별로 이제 그 완료 조건이 이제 새롭게 이제 추가가 됐습니다.
As you guys already know that before the Kazan competition, we have no time limit or specific dates for the specific test standard. But from the Kazan competition, the competitors are gonna have the mandatory task for the specific date.
그래서 그 질소 가압을 하는 날짜에 반드시 맞춰서 우리가 이제 그 대회에 맞춰서 이제 완료를 해야 되고요.
Actually, so in case of the pressure test, if the test project says the competitor should conduct the pressure test in a specific day, the competitor should conduct this test on the exact date.
그 질소 가압은 이제 우리 냉매가 지금 지난대 카잔 대회 이 과제인데 카잔 대회에서는 134A가 이제 사용이 됐고요.
This screen is about the test project, what we used for the Kazan competition. So in the last competition, we used the refrigerant code as R134A.
질소 가압은 아까 동영상 보셨지만은 월드스케일 그 스탠다드에서 표준에 의해서 그 모든 발부가 열려져 있어야 되고, 그다음에 발부를 여는 방법은 이제 전기 자석을 이용하는 방법과 이제 일반 발부는 그냥 뭐 스패너로 여는 방법 여러 가지 방법에 의해서 필요한 전체 배관에 부착되어 있는 발부가 다 열려진 상태에서 안전하게 스탠다드에 의해서 질소를 가압해야 되겠습니다.
So according to the world scale standard, when the competitor conduct the pressure test, all the valves should be open, including the solenoid valve or the general valve. So in case the competitor need to use the magnetic, electromagnetic, or the spanner to open the valve wall.
이제 가압은 뭐 과제에 나와 있는 가압에 맞게 압력에 맞게 가압을 하고 가압을 한 후에는 그 질소병을 이제 태그아웃 시켜야 되겠죠.
So once apply the pressure to the refrigeration system, so it should the competitor should follow the standard or the setting in the test project, and then after finishing applying the pressure to the systems, they need to make sure they take out the refrigerant cylinder.
우리가 방치 시험은 그 15분 동안 주어지는데.
So in case of the discharge test, so it's gonna be conducted for 15 minutes.
스타팅해서 15분 동안 그 압력 변화가 없어야 되는데 그거는 1도씨를 기준으로 1도씨 이하로 이제 압력 변화가 있으면 안 된다고 이제 규정이 되어 있는 거죠.
So according to our world scale standard, from the starting time, so for 15 minutes, the pressure should not be changed during this time and based on the 1 Celsius degree temperatures.
1도씨라는 거는 지금 1도씨는 온도인데 온도가 이제 압력으로 환산이 되겠죠. 압력이 환산돼서 그 압력 이하로 내려가면 이제 누설로 보는 거죠.
So regarding to the 1 Celsius degree, what is mentioned on the test project can be converted into the pressure unit. So after converting the temperature to the pressure, the whole pressure of the system should not be dropped according to the specific pressure.
개중의 선수들이 다 잘하는데 이제 개중의 선수들은 마음이 급한 나머지 그 브레이징이 끝난 직후 그러면 그 배관 온도가 상당히 높은 상태에서 질소를 가압함으로써 열이 식으면서 이제 압이 내려가는 그런 경우가 종종 있습니다.
So most of the competitors are good at this procedure, but some of the competitors are hurry to start the evacuation test. So if the competitor start this test right after the brazing, because the whole the pipe is very hot and then the temperature is very high, so it can affect to the pressure drop.
그래서 프러시아 드롭이 그 온도에서 생기지 않기 위해서는 배관 온도가 완전히 식은 다음에 가압을 하는 게 포인트겠습니다.
So the main point of this procedure is that the competitor should conduct this test after checking the hold pipe completely get cooled down for making sure it not get affected by the temperature.
지금 가압 압력은 그 55도씨에 해당하는 55도 그 포화 온도에 해당하는 압력으로 가압을 하게 되어 있습니다.
So according to the test project, it said that the competitor should apply the pressure exactly equivalent to 55 Celsius saturated temperature.
제가 대충 계산을 해보니까
According to my rough calculations,
킬로파스칼 정도가 되네요.
the 55 Celsius saturation temperature is going to be about 1390 kilopascals pressure.
이제 여기 보면은 그 선수가 작성을 하고 심사위원 입회하에 이제 프레셔 테스트를 해야 됩니다.
And this blank should be completed by the competitor, and then the competitor make sure to conduct the test under the expert supervisions.
이제 스타팅 시작 시간이 있고
There is a starting time,
그다음에 피니시 타임
and there is also finishing time on the test
그다음에
project.
뭐 똑같이 sorry. 이거 안 된다. 똑같은 압력 변화가 없다고 한다면은 뭐 만점을 받을 것이고.
So if the result is like that, the competitor can get the full score because there is no change in the pressure.
이게 드랍이 되면은 이제 자 2차 시도를 해야 되겠습니다.
And then in the other case, there can be some pressure drop like that. So the competitor have the second chance to attempt the pressure test.
이렇게 하면 이제 점수는 여기서 이제 점수를 잃을 것이고요.
So in this case, the competitor is going to lose the point for the first attempt.
2차 시기에 만약에 통과되면 2차 시기 점수를 얻을 것입니다.
And then after that, if the competitor succeed in the second pressure test, he or she is going to take the score for the second
물론
attempt.
1차 시기에도 물론 합격을 하면 이제 두 개의 점수를 다 받을 수 있고요.
In case that if the competitor succeed in the pressure test, pass the pressure test for the first attempt, he's going to take a 2 full mark.
55도에 해당하는 거는 우리 그 도면에 보면은 이게 크게 안 보이는데. 지금 우리가 들어가는 게 134A이고 킬로파스칼.
So now let's have a look at the pressure and temperature chart. So we are going to use the refrigerant R134A. So
아까 55도였으니까 여기 만나는 지점.
So the temperature mentioned in the test projects was 55 Celsius degree. So
지금 우리가 원하는 건 요 경계선에 지금 있긴 한데
the crossing point is between the line
55도씨니까
because it's a 55 Celsius degree. It's going to be located between 54 and 56.
요거는 요 차이 값을 뺀 다음에
In this case, you need to subtract 1370 from 1411.
예를 들면 그게 뭐 40이라고 가정하면은
For example, the difference is 40,
나누기 2 하면은 이제 한 20이 될 거고
and then if you divided it into 2, it's going to be
요
20.
낮은 압력이 플러스 20을 하면은 요 중간 압력 정도가 나올 것 같습니다.
And then plus the 20 for the margin pressures. So you can assume the middle value between the 54 and the 56.
모든 압력은 모든 온도에서 압력 구하는 거는 지금 설명드린 것처럼 여러분들이 구하시면 되고요.
You can apply this methods whenever you trying to convert the temperature to the pressure.
모든 게 이상이 없을 때는 이제 세계국 심사위원이 이 부분에 이제 사인을 할 거고요. 이상이 없다고.
If there is no issue or problem in the pressure test, 3 of the experts is going to give the competitor their own signature.
이게 시그니처가 없든가
If there is no signature on it,
두 번 다 실패를 한 상태에서
or if the competitor fails to conduct the 2 times of a pressure test,
그 다음 이바큐에이션으로 넘어갈 수가 없습니다.
it is not allowed to move to the next step, the evacuation.
반드시 이바큐에이션은 그 지난번에 그 프레셔 테스트를 합격한 사람들만 이쪽으로 넘을 수 있습니다.
So please make sure that the competitor can move to the next step for the evacuation test after completing the pressure test first.
어차피 프레셔 테스트를 합격하지 못하면은 이바큐움도 안 될 확률이 높기 때문에
And then actually it has a very high possibility to fail to the evacuation test if the competitor failed to the pressure test previously.
이바큐에이션도 지금 그 어느 날 어떻게 해야 되는지를 설명하고 있고요.
And then the sentence what I highlighted is about the task must be done on the specific date.
요건 아마도 뭐 이렇게 될 수도 있지만 변화될 확률도 있고요.
It can be maintained or changed in the next competitions.
그다음에 진공 시험은 이 또한 월드스키 스탠다드에서 이제 우리가 해야 되고.
The evacuation test also should also be conducted according to the world skill standard.
딥바큐움 메소드 딥바큐움 방식으로 해야 되고.
The competitor need to use the deep vacuum method.
그다음에 진공이 1000 마이크론 이하까지 진공이 돼야 되고요.
The competitor need to make the whole system should be under at least 1,000 microns of the vacuum level.
또한 시스템에서 진공 펌프가 제거가 된 다음에
After taking the vacuum pump from the system,
10분 동안에 500 마이크론 이상이 상승하면은 안 되는 걸로 되어 있습니다.
after taking out the vacuum pump from the system, for 10 minutes, the whole system should not have the more than 5 microns rise in the system.
예를 들어서 어떤 선수가 200 마이크론즈까지 하고 10분 동안 해가지고 500이 우리의 맥시멈이니까 하면 전체가 이제 700 마이크론즈인데 700 마이크론즈가 됐을 때는 이제 합격이고 이상이 됐을 때 700 이상 됐을 때는 이제 합격이 안 되겠죠.
So for example, if one competitor make the whole system under the 200 microns vacuum level, and then from the 200 microns level, the competitor started to discharge procedure for 10 minutes. So after 10 minutes, if the vacuum level is 700 microns or less than that, it is passed. Or if the competitor has more than the 700 microns level, the evacuation test has been failed.
가장 중요한 거는 그래서 이 1000 마이크론즈 이하로 충분히 충분히 낮게 하는 게 중요하고요.
So the very important point in this evacuation test procedure is to make the enough vacuum state of the system.
딥바큐um 하는 게 제일 좋고.
So it means the deep vacuum.
그 지금 이게 우리 요 내용은 우리 월드스케일 스탠다드고.
This explanation, what I gave you now, is based on the world scale standard.
제 기억으로는 이 전 대회, 그러니까 카잔 그 전 대회, 아부다비 대회 때라든가 아니면 브라질 상파울루 대회 때는 요거와 조금 다르게 우리가 적용을 했습니다.
As I remember that, unlike the last Kazan competition, in the Abu Dhabi competition and the São Paulo competition, we applied the different methods.
뭐 심플하게 하기 위해서 이제 1000 마이크론 이하까지 언더까지 지금 바큐움을 하고 그다음에 1000을 넘지 않으면 이제 되는 걸로 1000 이상만 올라가지 않으면.
And then to simplify this procedure, so we said that the vacuum level should be under the 1000 microns, and then it is okay not if it is not over the 1000 microns level.
예를 들면 어떤 선수가 이제 100 마이크론즈까지 했고.
For example, if one competitor makes the refrigeration system as the 100 microns level of vacuum,
10분 후에 쟀는데 600이면은 전체가 이제 700이니까.
So, and then this competitor discharged the systems for 10 minutes, and then after 10 minutes, the vacuum levels goes up to the 700 microns.
예를 들어서 이 상태면은 카자한 대회에서는 이 선수는 통과가 안 된 것이고, 왜냐면 600이 오버가 됐으니까, 500이 오버가 됐으니까 100만큼이.
In this case, if we apply the last Kazan competition rule, this competitor couldn't pass the evacuation test because the total amount of the vacuum levels rise more than 500.
하지만 그 아부다비 대회 때는 이 1000을 넘지 않았기 때문에 이것도 오케이로 해준 거죠. 오케이, 괜찮다 이렇게 그때는.
Unlike the Kazan competition, in the Abu Dhabi competition, this competitor make the systems under the 1000 microns level of a vacuum. So, in this case, in the Abu Dhabi competition, this competitor would have passed this evacuation test.
하지만 제 생각에는 아마 그 지금 이 방식이 변하지 않을 거로 생각하고 있습니다.
But in my opinion, we are going to maintain the same standard and the rules similar to the last Kazan competitions.
맞나요? 로엘 맞나요?
Is that right, Noel?
이제 또 중요한 게 여기까지만 제가 설명을 드리겠습니다. 중요한 게 또 하나가 있는데 이제 바큐움 테스트를 통과하면은
The one more important thing is that after finishing the evacuation test,
이제 진공을 깨는 바큐움을 깨는 작업을 해줘야 됩니다.
the competitor need to conduct the procedure to break the vacuum state.
그 이유는 이제 바큐움 상태로 장비를 놔두면 이제 브룩축 가스가 논 컨덴싱 가스가 계속 들어가기 때문에 그걸 방지하기 위해서 바큐움을 파괴하게 됩니다. 진공 파괴를.
The reason why the competitor should break the vacuum state after finishing the evacuation test is to prevent the non-condensable gas get created.
그래서 지금 여기 보시면은 1.5kg 무게를 달아서 그 134의 냉매를 리퀴드 냉매를 그 장비에 넣게끔 되어 있습니다.
So according to the test projects, by using the R134A refrigerant, the competitor need to charge about 1.5 kilogram of refrigerant to the system.
구체적으로 제시한 것도 아마 가장 대회가 처음인 것 같고 예전에는 뭐 어느 압력으로 주든가 아니면은 그냥 파괴만 얘기가 있었던 것 같고요. 제 기억으로는.
According to my memories, and it is the first time to give the specific number of the weight for the charging the refrigerant in the Kazan competition. Before the Kazan competition, it just said break the vacuum, or it just suggests the pressure numbers.
그다음에 이제 냉매를 이렇게 안 하면은 냉매를 예를 들어 정량을 다 넣어버리면 안 되고 여기 정해진 양만큼만 넣어야 됩니다.
So according to this sentence in the test project, the competitor should charge the exact amount of a refrigerant to the system, not over or not less than this.
뭐 채점할 때는 마킹할 때는 뭐 1.5 플러스 마이너스 얼마가 되겠죠. 뭐 정확해질 수는 없으니까.
We are going to give you some tolerance for around the 1.5 kilogram when we marking the competitor's task.
선수는 이제 그 이렇게 주입한 내용을 여기 기입을 해야 되고.
The competitor also need to complete the fill in the blank.
여기다 넣어야 되고 그다음에 충전 전 무게, 충전 전이 맞죠? 충전 전, 그다음에 충전 후 차이 값을 여기다 적으시면 되겠습니다.
So the first one is the weight prior to charge, and then the second one is after completing the charge, and then the last one is the difference between prior to and the after of charging.
제가 뭐 간략적으로 설명을 드렸고 대부분 그 참가했던 국가들은 이런 기본적인 내용을 다 아시고 계실 거고 이제 아마 지금 대회를 처음 준비하는 국가들이나 좀 나온 지 얼마 안 되는 국가들에서는 조금 잘 이해를 못하는 부분들이 있었을 텐데 앞으로 우리가 4차를 하면서 이런 내용을 좀 더 깊이 있게 다루겠습니다.
So this is my brief explanation and then lecture about the first session of our YouTube Live. And then I know that some existing competitor or the countries who have a lot of experience in the competition already knew about this basic information. But in case of the new country or the country who has a lack of experience in the competition, it can be a little bit difficult, but we are trying to make it the better and the additional information through the 4 sessions of a YouTube live lecture in total.
저희가 여기서 너무 이렇게 디테일한 부분까지는 다루기가 좀 어렵고요. 어쨌든 우리 지금 오늘 다행히 로엘 SCM 들어왔고 또 데프트 칩 그 카스텐하고 또 저 같이 있기 때문에 우리 로엘이 지금 그동안 많은 저희 직종에 대해서 고민을 하고 또 스탠다드도 지금 많이 개편을 했고 또 지난 대회 그 심사위원들의 어떤 불만사항, 뭐 잘된 점, 잘못된 점들을 지적한 점을 다 보완해서 지금 준비를 하고 있는 걸로 알고 있습니다.
Actually, please understand that it is really hard to deal with all the details, information, and then the materials about our skills. And then, as I mentioned previously, here the Noel and then the Carlson and me is joining this meeting together. And then I know that Noel also have a lot of considerations about our skill, and then he is also doing the improvement on our standard and then try to covering all of the experts' opinions.
상당히 자세하게 지금 스탠다드 작업 스탠다드 저 표준을 지금 로엘이 지금 그 수정 보완하고 있고.
And as I know that Noel is already doing a lot of modification or the updated on our skills standard specification very in detailed.
카스텐과 저도 같이 이제 검토를 해드리고 있는 상태입니다.
And also I and Carlson also help the Noel to improve our standard.
노엘의 그 노고에 감사드리고요.
Thank you for the Noel's hard work.
조금 더 우리가 이제 좀 더 디테일한 부분에 들어가면 또 좀 할 게 있지만 그건 이제 차차 대회 때 좀 정하면 될 것 같고요.
And then we still have a lot of details issue to be communicated and debated in the future. But we still have a lot of time to debate about this issue.
어쨌든 우리 로열은 또 많은 우리 냉동 쪽에 경험이 많으신 분이고
As you guys already know, that Noah has a lot of experience in this refrigeration and air conditioning
저기
skills.
최대 전문가시고
And then he's the best expert in these skills, I know.
카스텐도 뭐 심사장 오랫동안 하셨고
Of course, Carsten as well, because he also have a lot of experience as the chief expert in the competitions.
두 분과 같이 제가 또 상하이 대회를 하게 돼서 너무 영광이고 감사하게 생각합니다.
I'm really happy and an honor to participate in this team for our next World Skill Competition in Shanghai.
그 지금 어디가 들어왔는지 저는 잘 파악이 안 돼서 혹시 들어있는 질문사항 그 엑스포트나 아니면 컴피티터가 있으면은 좀 질문을 받고 싶고요.
Actually, it is a little bit hard to check all of the participants on the Zoom or the YouTube streaming. So please, if you have any questions, so feel free to ask any questions, competitor or the
네.
expert. 다 그냥 인사말이고 질문은 아직까지 없습니다. Carsten.
제가 나가볼까요? 이게 나가볼까요, 제가?
일단 본인은 뭐 질문 사항 없으시고 일단 강의에 감사하고 Yes, we can hear you. 강의에 감사하고
Thank you.
Thank you, Joel, and also from my side, yeah, it was a good session and good points you mentioned. Of course, we have to learn from our experience from Japan. So at the end, for me, it's very important, and I think for everybody that we give the competitors good chances to fulfill their tasks, and especially we have to think about the pressure test and the evacuation test. What tolerances or in what ranges will accept maybe some work. It must be clear that the system must be very tight. This is clear. But on the other hand, also you mentioned also in your videos, it's in several ways we have problems. Maybe problems with the hoses, problems with the measurement, etc. And this is a very important point we have to solve before. So maybe we have to check more better the measurements and the possibilities we can reach, and with this we can maybe adapt our marketing so that we really give the competitors the best chances to really reach the end and not have to step after to stop after the vacuum test. This is clear. So this is the experience. So for Shanghai we are better prepared, especially with your
둘이서 쌈 나겠는데.
and all the documentation.
의견이 다르네요.
나가는 거야? 나가면 안 되는데 아직.
Okay,
너의
no is out, right? Okay.
왜 나가버린 거야?
네, 뭐 연결이 끊겼을 수도 있을 것
손
같고요.
들고 나갔는데. 어쨌든 그 노엘이 나갔는데. 저도 카스텐 의견에 많이 공감을 합니다. 그 선수들이 어떻게 보면은 그 오랜 기간 고생해서 대회에 참가했는데 어떤 너무 이렇게 타이트하게 그 규정을 만들다 보면은 많은 선수들이 중간에 이제 탈락을 하게 되고 그런 경우가 작년에 좀 안타까운 일이 많이 있었는데 그런 부분은 저도 보완이 됐으면 좋겠고 모든 선수가 처음부터 끝까지 다 그 참여를 할 수 있는 그런 대회 그런 진행이 됐으면 좋겠습니다. 저는 카스텐과 의견이 좀 많은 부분 일치합니다.
Okay, Carsten, I also agree with your opinion. Actually, we all knew that all the competitors have the great effort and hard working for taking part in this world skill competition. So sometimes the tight or the strict rule or the standards can give them a lot of a failure in each procedure of the test project. As like a Kazan competition. So we need to try to make up for this part to help the competitors, and then we need to try to improve and then develop the whole test project task to help all the competitor to finish from the first task to the last task.
서지요, 헬로.
Hello, Sergio.
서지 한번 뭐. 네. 저기 뭐 코버스가 어디죠? 쟤 누구지? 네? 남아공.
Cobus, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hello.
I would just like to, from South Africa's side, on the technical delegate assistant, compliment the capacity building center and Carsten and Joel for this work and the initiative that you are doing, because we've got new experts, and I think this is an excellent platform to prepare and ensure that our competitors are on a level playing field by the time they get to Shanghai. I would just like to compliment the whole HRD team and everybody involved for making this available for countries to use this to better prepare our competitors. Thank you all very much.
네. 어쨌든 지금 오늘 저희가 준비한 게 지금 뭐 서지어 또 카스텐 다 이렇게 들어오셨지만은 이제 우리끼리 논의할 문제도 많이 있지만은 특히 저희가 그 HRD 코리아에서 이렇게 한 이유는 이제 지금 남아공처럼 새롭게 시작하는 국제 심사위나 새롭게 시작하는 컴피티터를 위해서 제가 이런 프로그램을 만든 그 이유입니다.
Actually, right. As the Mr. Visage mentioned, that HRD Korea team just make all of this live lecture and the video clip for helping the new competitor, the new expert who join in the World Skills International competition in the first time.
하지만 이제 카스텐하고 이제 서지어 들어왔지만 이제 전부 누가 들어왔는지 자세히는 모르겠지만은 저희가 대회 때는 기간이 짧으니까 또 이런 기회를 통해서 저희가 좀 의견을 나누고 소통하는 시간을 가지면은 대회에서 좀 더 원활하게 또 좀 불이익당한 선수가 없고 억울한 선수가 없고 서지오 그 카잔에서 그 나이트로젠 때문에 질서 때문에 많은 마음고생했을 텐데 이제 그런 일도 우리가 좀 미리 좀 대비를 해야 될 것 같습니다.
Actually, it is a really great time to share our opinion, to have a communication between the experts before starting the competition, because as you already knew that we always suffer from the lack of the time during the competition. So for making our next competition being proceeded smoothly, and then to not to make the competitor who just feels unfair during the competition. So we need to try to do our best. And then I also understood Sergio's last competition situation regarding to the nitrogen gas, so we also feel sorry about that, you and the competitors.
좀 저로서는 카스텐하고 서지오 또 이렇게 경험 많으신 분들이 우리가 냉동 공진능력을 좀 많이 이끌어 주시고 지금까지 카스텐이 했던 것 제가 가장 존경하는 분 중에 한 분이고 서지오도 마찬가지고 그래서 경험 많은 분들이 조금 더 봉사하고 좀 이끌어 주셨으면 좋겠습니다.
Please, I would like to ask you guys a favor, Carson and Sergio, because you guys have a lot of experience in this refrigeration and air conditioning skills. So please help me to proceed the competition by leading this skill with us. And then I also would like to express my respect to all of you guys.
I hope we will be a good team together with Well. I think you're on a very good way. Again, it's very good work you have done with your team, and it has everybody, all the other experts, new experts, and all the competitors who you have maybe also a better focus, better idea what happened on the field, on the competition area, and yeah. Corona makes it possible. This is a thing. It's clear. And next month I will have the next experience with Euroskills in Austria. Together with Rupert, we will come together, and Carlos from Spain, who will be there, the chief expert, and so we will see.
카로스가 칩 엑스퍼트인가 보구나.
Under Corona field, so we have lots of important things we have to consider. Hopefully everything goes well. I hope that we also have a better situation next year for Shanghai, so that this event will be a great event and not too much problematic event next year. So we will see. But I hope the best for everybody. So I have my best team. I'm prepared for this.
서지오 의견 뭐 있으면 좋은 의견.
Hi, Sergio.
Very important thing about nitrogen factor, because in the last competition there is some conditions not very good. Some competitors working one day for nothing
Yeah.
because of the nitrogen. I think it's necessary to improve our competition for every competitor. It's important to discuss this kind of questions. For fair play, very important for every competitor. I do not like it in the last competition. I think there is some problem. But guys, I want to get a better competition.
So with this experience from Kazan, I hope we can really learn, and make it much better for the competitors. Because this is but this is the most important. We have to do a good job as experts and competition manager and also the workshop manager and all the team in Shanghai. And on the other hand, the competitors. Yeah, we do this for the competitor, and we should not fight against competitors, etc. So this is my way of life, and so we work for the competitors and not the competitors work for us. So this we have to really consider. But nevertheless, we have described and we have fixed rules, and of course to keep everybody the same way. Of course, everything what we have decided before and decided what is the marking scheme, etc. Of course, this is our rule, yeah, and this we have to follow. And sometimes, of course, we have to speak about tolerances or maybe to speak about differences, what we can accept or not accept. But every time is the way to make the best for the competitor. Nevertheless, we will find in every way the best who have then the right to have the gold medal or silver medal. This is also clear. But also it's important to make everybody happy that this is a good experience in Shanghai.
오케이. 그 제 개인적인 생각은 그 각국 엑스퍼트들이 다 각국에서는 다 전문가들인데 그 제가 국제 대회를 뭐 많이는 안 나가봤지만 좀 의견 차이 아니면은 시각 차이 이런 게 많은 것 같습니다. 그래서 그 시각 차이를 좁히는 게 우리한테는 제일 중요하고 저는 그 기억납니다. 아부다비 대회 때인가 이제 기억이 나는데 카스텐이 그 브레이징한 그 질을 조인트 질을 이렇게 네 가지 질을 이렇게 심사한테 보여줬는데 그게 이제 다 다른 거죠. 보는 시각이. 그래서 우리가 원하는 그 풀마크는 따로 있는데 그게 다 다르니까 그거를 통일시키는 게 우리가 이제 상하이에 대해서 성공할 수 있는 길이라고 저는 생각합니다. 그런 걸 이제 카스텐하고 SCM 노예라고 저하고 준비해야 될 일이 아닌가 생각됩니다.
So actually, I know that all of you guys are the best expert in each other's countries, but in this case, the best thing we need to do for preparing for the next competition is that we need to try to narrow down the difference between each other's opinion and then the insight about the issue. So, for example, in an Abu Dhabi competition, Karsten just showed the four examples of praising to all of the experts, and then each expert has all the different opinions to the four of the examples, right? So the best way we need to do for preparing the successful competition, we need to unify those opinions as one. That's the what we need to do, Karsten and Nguyen, as all the experts.
오케이. 땡큐. 우리가 이제 시간이 다 돼서 오늘 사실 교육을 하게 됐는데 이런 또 깊은 진행이 돼서 너무 감사합니다.
I'm really appreciated to have this time because we also gave you the lecture and then we also had the very meaningful communication between the each experts.
다음은 이제 일정을 저희가 공유할 건데 그때도 조금 개인적으로 카스텐하고 서지가 좀 들어와서 좀 좋은 의견 또 제가 혹시라도 실수한 거 있으면 바로 잡아 주셨으면 좋겠습니다.
So we are going to share our next live session schedules after that. So next time, please come to join in this June with us, Sergio and Carson, and please give your opinion or any correction about my explanation if I make any mistake or error. Please to join us.
다른 국가에서 혹시 질문사항 없으면은 우리 마치도록 하겠습니다.
And actually, we almost are out of time, so if you guys have no further questions, maybe we can wrap up our today's session over here.
Thank you. Okay. 오케이. 자, 그러면 이제 다음 번을 기약하면서 저희 say goodbye 할 시간이 된 것 같습니다. It's time to say goodbye. See you again. Kasten. Thank you.